Okay, so we're going to start because of WinnDixie. The chapters are short, so I'll read 2, sometimes 3 chapters a night. Otherwise, we won't get through the book and you'll get lost. So, Chapter 1, and this takes place in the South, so I get to use my Southern accent. My name is India Opal Baloney, and last summer my daddy, the preacher, sent me to the store for a box of macaroni and cheese and some rice and 2 tomatoes, and I came back with a dog. This is what happened. I walked into that produce section of the WinnDixie grocery store to pick out my 2 tomatoes, and I almost bumped right into the store manager. He was standing there all red-faced, screaming, waving his arms around. "Who let that dog in here?" he kept shouting. "Who let that dirty dog in here?" At first, I didn't see no dog. There were just a lot of vegetables rolling around on the floor, tomatoes and onions and green peppers. And there was what seemed like a whole army of WinnDixie employees running around waving their arms just the same as the way the store manager was waving his. And then the dog came around the corner. He was a big dog and ugly. He looked like he was having a real good time, though. His tongue was hanging out, and he was wagging his tail, and he skidded to a stop and smiled right at me. I had never before in my life seen a dog smile, but that is what he did. He pulled back all his lips and showed me all his teeth, and then he wagged his tail so hard that he knocked some oranges off the display, and they went rolling everywhere, mixing with the tomatoes and the onions and the green peppers. The manager screamed, "Somebody grab that dog!" The dog went running over to the manager, wagging his tail and smiling. He stood up on his hind legs, and you could tell all he wanted to do was get face to face with that manager and thank him for the good time he was having in the produce department. But somehow, he ended up knocking over the manager. And the manager must have had a very bad day, because lying there on the floor right in front of everybody, he started to cry. The dog leaned over him real concerned and licked his face. "Please," said the manager, "somebody call the pound." "Wait a minute," I hollered. "That's my dog. Don't call the pound." All the WinnDixie employees turned around and looked at me, and I knew I had done something big. And maybe stupid, too. But I couldn't help it. I couldn't let that dog go to the pound. "Here, boy," I said. And the dog stopped licking the manager's face and put his ears up in the air, and he looked at me like he was trying to remember where he knew me from. "Here, boy," I said again. And I figured that the dog was probably just like everybody else in the world, that he would want to get called by a name. So I didn't know what his name was, so I just said the first thing that came into my head. "Here, WinnDixie." The dog came trotting over to me just like that had been his name his whole life. The manager sat up and gave me a hard stare, like maybe I was making fun of him. "It's his name," I said, "honest." The manager said, "Don't you know not to bring dogs into the grocery store?" "Yes, sir," I told him. "He got in by mistake. I'm sorry, it won't happen again. Come on, WinnDixie," I said to the dog. And I started walking, and he followed behind me as if he went out of the produce department, down the cereal aisle, past the cashiers, and out the door. Once we were safe outside, I checked him over real careful. He didn't look that good. He was big, but he was skinny. You could see all of his ribs, and there were bald patches all over him, places where you didn't have any fur at all. Mostly he looked like a big old piece of brown carpet that had been left out in the rain. "You're a mess," I told him. I don't bet you belong to anybody." He smiled at me. He did that thing again where he pulled back his lips and showed me all his teeth. He smiled so big that it made him sneeze. It was like he was saying, "I know I'm a mess. Isn't it funny?" It's hard not to immediately fall in love with a dog who has a good sense of humor. "Come on," I told him, "let's see what the preacher has to say about you." And the two of us, me and WinnDixie, started walking home. Chapter 2. That summer I found WinnDixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be a new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy was a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think of him as my daddy, because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so In my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was even born, he had a missionary in India, and that's how I got my first name. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, with me and WinnDixie walking home, I told him how I got my name. I told him how I just moved to Naomi, and I also told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even though he was too distracted with his sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. But you know what? I told WinnDixie, you are a suffering dog, so maybe he'll take you in right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you. WinnDixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping, like something was wrong with one of his legs. And I have to admit, he stunk bad. He was an ugly dog, but I already loved him with my whole heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told WinnDixie that he had to behave, right, and be quiet, because this was an adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was the preacher, and I was a good kid, and I was quiet. I was with the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alford, called an exception. And I told WinnDixie that he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alford's cats or Mr. Detweller's yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. WinnDixie looked at me, and I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. Sit, I told him when we got by my trailer, and he sat right down. He had really good manners. Stay here, I told him. I'll be right back. And the preacher was sitting in the living room. He was working on his little fold-out table. He had papers and spread them all around like he was rubbing his nose, which he always meant he was thinking hard. Daddy, I said to him. Mm-hmm, he said back. Daddy, you know how you always told me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves? Mm-hmm, he said, and he rubbed his nose and looked down at his papers. Well, I said, I found a less fortunate at the grocery store. Is that right? He said. Yes, sir. I told him I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle, hiding inside a shell, in there thinking about things, not even ever sticking his head out into the world. Well, Daddy, I was wondering if this less fortunate could stay with us for a while. Finally, the preacher looked up at me. Opal, he said. What are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dog, said the preacher. We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog. I know it. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look, I said. And I went to the trailer door and I hollered, WinnDixie! WinnDixie's ears shot up in the air, and he grinned and sneezed, and then he came rumping over to the stairs into the trailer and put his head right in the preacher's lap, right on top of the pile of papers. The preacher looked down at WinnDixie. He looked at me. He looked at his ribs. He looked at his matted up fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. WinnDixie looked up at the preacher, and he pulled back his lips, showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth, and wagged his tail, knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed, and some more papers fluttered to the floor. What did you call this dog? The preacher asked. WinnDixie. I whispered. I was afraid. I was afraid I was going to break the spell. WinnDixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. Oh, well, said the preacher. He's a stray if I've ever seen one. And he put down his pencil, scratched WinnDixie behind the ears. And a less fortunate, too, that's for sure. Are you looking for a home? The preacher asked in a real soft voice to WinnDixie. WinnDixie wagged his tail. Well, said the preacher, I guess you found one. Chapter 3. I started on WinnDixie right away, trying to clean him up. First, I gave him a bath. I used the garden hose and some baby shampoo. He stood still for it, but I could tell he didn't like it. He looked insulted the whole time. He didn't show me his teeth or wag his tail once. After he was all washed up and dried, I brushed him. I brushed him good. I used my own hairbrush, and I worked real hard at the knots and the patches of fur that stuck together. He didn't mind being brushed. Kind of wiggled his back. I think it felt pretty good. The whole time I was working on him, I was talking to him, and he listened to me. So I told him how we were like. See, I said, you don't have any family, and neither do I. Well, I got the preacher, of course, but I don't have a mama. I mean, I have one, but I don't know where she is. She left when I was 3 years old. I can't hardly remember her at all. And I bet you don't remember your mama much either. So we are almost like orphans. WinnDixie looked straight at me when I said that to him, like he was feeling relieved to finally have somebody understand his situation. I nodded my head at him and went on talking. I don't even have any friends because I had to leave them all when I came here and moved from Whately. Whately's up north in Florida. Have you ever been up north Florida? WinnDixie looked down to the ground like he was trying to remember if he ever had been. You know what? I said, ever since we moved here, I've been thinking about my mama extra hard. More than I ever did when I was in Whately. WinnDixie twitched his ears up and raised his eyebrows. I think the preacher thinks about my mama all the time, too. He's still in love with her. I know that because I heard the ladies in the church at Whately talking about him. They said he still hopes she's coming back. But he doesn't tell me that. He won't talk to me about her at all. I want to know more about my mama, but I'm afraid to ask the preacher. I'm afraid he'll get mad at me. When Dixie looked hard at me like I was trying to say something. What? I said to him, and he stared at me. You think I should make the preacher tell me about her, don't you? WinnDixie looked at me so hard he sneezed. I'll have to think about it, I said. When I was done working on him, WinnDixie looked a whole lot better. He still had his bald spots, but the fur he did have was cleaned up, and it was nice, and it was all shiny and soft. You could see his ribs still, but I intended to feed him good, and that would take care of that. I couldn't do anything about his crooked yellow teeth because he got into a sneezing fit every time I started brushing his teeth with my toothbrush. I finally gave up. But for the most part, he looked a whole lot better. And so I took him to the trailer and I showed him to the preacher. Daddy? I said. He said as he was working on his sermon, kind of muttering to himself. Daddy, I want to show you the new WinnDixie. The preacher put down his pencil, rubbed his nose, and finally sat up. Well, he said, smiling real big at WinnDixie. Well, now, don't you look handsome? WinnDixie smiled back at the preacher. He went over and put his head on the preacher's lap. He smells nice, too, said the preacher. He rubbed WinnDixie's head and looked into his eyes. Daddy? I said real quick before I lost my nerve. I've been talking to WinnDixie. Well, is that right? Said the preacher, who just scratched WinnDixie's head. I've been talking to him, and he agreed with me that since I'm 10 years old now, you should tell me 10 things about my mama. Just 10 things, that's all. The preacher stopped rubbing WinnDixie's head, and he held real still. I could still see that he was thinking and pulling his head back into his shell. One thing for each year I've been alive, I told him, please. WinnDixie looked up at the preacher, kind of giving him a nudge with his nose. The preacher sighed. He said to WinnDixie, I should have guessed you were going to be some trouble. Then he looked at me. Come on, Opal. He said, sit down. I will tell you 10 things about your mama. And that's the end. What do you think he's going to tell her? I will read chapters 4, 5, and 6 tomorrow.